I would rather chew glass than touch that desperate cow. Those were the exact words I heard echoing from my own library on the night of my daughter's engagement party. I froze in the shadows, holding a glass of scotch, listening as the man she was about to marry laughed with his best friend. He was plotting to drain her trust fund and run off to Miami with a woman named Sable. Most fathers would have stormed into the room and thrown a punch. But you do not survive 40 years in commercial real estate by losing your temper. You survive by smiling, setting a trap, and burying your enemies so deep they never see the sun again. Now, let me take you back. The clinking of crystal glasses drifted through the gardens of my Houston estate. I had dropped $95,000 to transform my backyard into a floral paradise. For my only daughter, Audrey, a gifted pediatrician whose heart was far too decent for the kind of world she was walking into. She was convinced she'd found her Prince Charming in Colt Farrow, a man who'd pitched himself as a tech startup chief executive officer. On my way back from the wine cellar, voices reached me from the direction of my private library. The oak doors sat slightly ajar. "Come on, man, she is not that bad. That was Bo Colt's best man." A soft chuckle came next, then the clink of ice settling in a glass. "Are you kidding me?" Colt's voice came back sharp, soaked in contempt. "She is clingy. She is obsessed. And frankly, she is a desperate cow. But she is the only child of Vincent Mercer. Do you have any idea what that means? Once we sign that registry, I get the keys to the Mercer Trust Fund. I just have to play the doting husband for 2 years. Then I cash out, file for divorce, and I am back on a yacht in Miami with Sable." My blood went cold. The name is Vincent Mercer. I assembled the largest commercial real estate portfolio in Texas. I have sat across the table from men who'd slit your throat over pocket change. Yet nothing, not one moment in 4 decades, had ever pushed me this close to violence. This smug parasite had the nerve to stand under my roof scheme against my daughter and call it a plan. To him, she wasn't a person. She was a line on a balance sheet. And me, a senile old fool about to gift wrap his empire and hand it over. Every instinct I had said, kick those doors off their hinges, seize him by the collar, and deposit him on the pavement outside. But I made myself stop and think it through. Going at him in that moment, I'd come out looking like the obsessive, overbearing father. Audrey was deep in love and blind to all of it. She'd be shattered, and Colt would twist the whole story until he was the wronged party. No. This required the kind of precision you bring to a hostile takeover, not a bar fight. I drew one long, measured breath, then shoved those heavy doors wide open. The crack of wood against the wall snapped both men to attention. Welcome to his hidden revenge, a place where the stories that keep you up at night finally get the endings they deserve. If that sounds like your kind of company, I would be glad to have you stay. A quiet like and a subscription mean more than you might think. They help these stories reach the people who need them most. Before we go any further, tell me something in the comments. Is this your first time sitting down with one of these stories? Or have you been here long enough to know how they tend to end? I am glad either way. One thing to mention before we begin: some details and dialogue have been shaped for the purposes of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of the story. Colt spun around so fast, his elbow clipped the mahogany desk, sending a few drops of expensive scotch skidding across the floor. Bo took a massive step backward, retreating into the dark corners of the library as though he were hoping the walls might absorb him entirely. His hands were shaking against his glass. For just a fraction of a second, I saw raw, unfiltered panic flash through Colt's eyes. He knew he had been caught. The arrogant smirk evaporated, replaced by the wide-cornered stare of a trapped animal. I moved toward them at a slow, deliberate pace. I kept my face entirely blank, holding the violent rage inside me perfectly still beneath the surface. You do not survive 40 years in the cutthroat world of Houston commercial real estate by letting your opponent see what you are feeling. You let him stand there and sweat. Vincent. "Sir," Colt stammered, frantically trying to pull himself together, dabbing at the liquor he had splashed on his suit jacket. "We were just admiring the architecture in here. The craftsmanship is really something." I stopped a few feet short of him. I did not glance at the ceiling or scan the bookshelves. I kept my eyes locked dead onto his and held them there. "I heard you," I said. My voice barely cleared a whisper, but it pressed down on the room like something with considerable weight behind it. I heard exactly what you called my daughter. I heard your brilliant exit strategy to Miami. I heard the name Sable. The air between us turned suffocating. Bo looked physically ill, his color gone, his grip white-knuckled around his glass. I stood there and waited for Colt to apologize. I waited for him to drop to his knees and beg. Neither happened. Instead, I watched his mind kick into motion, burning through 1,000 rapid calculations, reaching for any handhold he could find in the middle of a storm. And within seconds, he located one. He pushed out a laugh. Not a nervous, stumbling one, a condescending, almost pitying one. He tilted his head the way a man does when he is certain the person across from him has simply misread the room. "Vincent, you completely misunderstood. I swear to you on my life." Colt advanced a step, raising both open hands in front of him. "We were not talking about Audrey." "Good God, where would you even get that idea?" "We were talking about a client, a female investor out of Atlanta who has been breathing down my neck for the past 3 weeks. She is a massive cash cow for my technology firm, but she is impossibly demanding, desperate, and clingy. Bo was just joking that I ought to pursue her romantically to lock down the venture capital we need going into next quarter. I told him I would rather chew glass. I would never ever say something like that about Audrey. She is my entire world." It was a flawless lie, assembled in a single heartbeat and delivered with terrifying sincerity. He even managed to pull off a look of faint injury, projecting just the correct measure of wounded pride to make it land. If I had not spent the better part of my life across the negotiating table from corporate predators who could lie with perfect composure while staring at a crucifix, I might have swallowed the whole thing. But I didn't look away. I studied the fine details instead. His shoulders were carrying just a touch too much tension. His breathing moved at a pace just a fraction too hurried. A predator doing everything in its power to look harmless. I tightened my hold on my own glass, ready to methodically dismantle every plank of his alibi. I was going to demand his phone. I was going to demand the full identity of this fictional Atlantan investor. I intended to break him apart right there on the Persian rug in his rented tuxedo in my house. Before I could get a single word out, the library doors pushed open. Whatever had been building in that room shattered instantly. "There you are." A bright, easy voice drifted through the doorway. Audrey came in. She was radiant, her face lit with happiness that had nothing performed about it. She had on the white silk dress I had brought back from Milan for her just a month before. At 30 years old, she was already a deeply respected pediatrician at Houston Medical Center. She gave grueling 16-hour shifts to that hospital, fighting for premature babies and keeping frightened parents from falling apart at the seams. She carried a heart far too decent for the kind of ruthless world I had spent my life operating inside. She believed in people. She genuinely believed she had found her Prince Charming. She moved across the room and wrapped her arms around Colt from behind, settling her chin softly onto his shoulder. "What are my 2 favorite men discussing in here?" she asked, looking between us with a warm, unsuspecting smile. Colt covered her hands with his own. He kissed her cheek softly. "Just business, sweetheart. Your father and I were sharing a quiet moment." Then he tilted his gaze up to meet mine. Over Audrey's shoulder, a slow, deliberate smirk took shape on his face. He had just maneuvered his human shield squarely into the line of fire. His expression dared me openly go ahead, expose me right now in front of the woman who loves me completely. "Break her heart and do it," that smirk said. "Let us find out who she sides with." I looked at my daughter instead. I took in the absolute trust that lived in her eyes. My late wife had raised her from the beginning to seek out the goodness in every person she met. For a physician, that quality was a form of grace. Standing here tonight, it was her most exposed vulnerability. Without concrete, irrefutable proof in my hands, anything I said would devastate her and leave Colt the room he needed to rewrite the entire story with himself as the victim. I needed evidence. I needed to pull his life open seam by seam until there was not one dark corner remaining where he could keep anything hidden. "Just business," I said evenly. I answered his smirk with a cold, level look. "Go back and enjoy the party. I have a call to make." Colt gave a composed nod, his confidence visibly replenished. He took Audrey's hand and walked her out through the doors. They clicked shut. Silence moved back in. I took out my phone and dialed Garrett Pruitt, a private investigator who had handled sensitive corporate intelligence work on my behalf for years. "Garrett," I said the moment he picked up. "Colt Farrow. He is claiming his startup carries a $20 million valuation. I want you to peel him like an onion. Bank records, offshore accounts, text messages, every phone log you can access. Find a woman named Sable in Miami. I want to know what he orders for breakfast and the name of every person he currently owes money to. I need it all yesterday. Consider it done, sir. I ended the call and stood at the window, watching Colt circulate through the garden below, laughing, raising his glass, working the crowd of my friends, with the ease of a man who believes himself untouchable. He was convinced he had outplayed a clueless old fool. He was certain the game was already decided in his favor. He had just wandered onto a battlefield he lacked the experience to even recognize for what it was. The silent war had been set in motion, and I was going to see to it personally that he surrendered everything. He pressed a kiss to her cheek with a display of sickening affection. "Just business, sweetheart," he murmured softly. "Your father and I were simply sharing a quiet moment, talking through some startup strategies." Then his gaze lifted to meet mine. Over Audrey's shoulder, I watched that challenging, arrogant smirk crawl back across his lips. It was calibrated, meant for my eyes alone. He had just dragged his human shield into the line of fire. Those eyes of his dared me to call him a liar, right there in front of the woman who worshipped him. Go ahead and break her heart, that smirk seemed to say. Ruin her perfect night. Let's see who she trusts. My thoughts moved fast. If I told her the truth at that moment, without solid proof it was my word against his, Colt would reshape the story before I finished the sentence. He'd tell her that her wealthy, controlling father was working to tear apart her happiness. He'd paint me as paranoid, a man convinced that no one would ever be worthy of his only daughter. Audrey would be crushed, caught between two people she loved, in a war she didn't ask for. I could lose her entirely. I could drive her straight into his arms. I looked at my daughter. I saw the total unshaken trust written across her face. I saw the joy pouring out of her smile. She had no idea she was holding the hand of a man who saw her as nothing beyond a balance sheet. I had to protect her, but not recklessly. I needed hard, irrefutable evidence. I needed financial records, text messages, and proof of this woman named Sable. I needed to strip his life down, layer by layer, until there was no shadow left for him to disappear into. Just business, I repeated slowly. I forced my face to loosen. I met his arrogant smile with a flat, empty stare. You boys head back and enjoy the party. I have a call to make, closing a deal. Colt gave a single nod, his confidence fully restored. He believed he had walked away the winner. He thought I had swallowed his pitiful lie whole. He took Audrey's hand and guided her toward the door. Don't work too late, Dad, Audrey called back, blowing me a kiss. We need you out there for the toasts. I'll be right there, sweetheart, I promised. The psychological war had officially begun, and I was going to dismantle his life brick by brick. I turned from the library doors and moved quickly down the grand hallway toward my private office. My heart was hammering against my ribs, pounding in my ears like a war drum. The sheer physical cost of holding back that level of violent, explosive rage was draining. Every fiber in my body had screamed at me to grab Colt by his lapels and hurl him through the stained glass windows. But you do not build a commercial real estate empire in Houston by surrendering to your primal instincts. You build it by keeping absolute control precisely when everyone around you expects you to shatter. I stepped into my office, locked the heavy mahogany door behind me, and crossed to the concealed wall safe. I entered the combination, the mechanical clicks sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Inside sat a secure, encrypted cell phone. I bypassed my usual contacts and dialed a number reserved for situations that demanded absolute, ruthless discretion. The line rang twice before a gruff, alert voice picked up. "Garrett," I said, keeping my voice perfectly measured and cold. "It's Vincent Mercer. I'm sorry to reach out this late on a weekend, but I need your services right away." Garrett Pruitt was a former corporate espionage specialist who had moved into high-stakes private investigation. He was a man who operated entirely in the shadows, one who made his living dismantling the polished facades of powerful, dishonest people. "Mr. Mercer," Garrett replied, his voice utterly free of surprise. "It's never too late for my best client. What do you need?" I crossed the length of the office, eyes fixed on the large window overlooking the rear gardens. "It concerns Colt Farrow, the man downstairs, right now celebrating his engagement to my only daughter. He presents himself as the founder and chief executive of a technology startup called Aerotech Solutions. He claims the company carries a $20 million valuation and is gearing up for a major funding round. I want you to peel him like an onion, Garrett. I want his entire life taken apart piece by piece. begin with the business. I want incorporation documents, tax returns, and full client lists. I want to know whether Aerotech Solutions actually ships a single line of software, or whether it's nothing but a hollow shell built to rope in naive investors. I'll pull the corporate filings tonight, Garrett said smoothly. The sound of a keyboard was already audible beneath his voice. What else? Dig into his personal finances, I said, my tone sharpening. Find any offshore accounts. Pull his credit reports from every major bureau. Find out exactly who he owes money to and how much. Look for outstanding loans, private equity debts, any unsavory financial obligations. A man who schemes to steal a trust fund is almost always a desperate man running from something enormous. I want to know exactly what's on his heels. I let a beat of silence pass as the next piece settled in my mind. And Garrett, one more thing. There's a woman named Sable. She's based in Miami. I don't have a surname, but Colt mentioned her tonight. I want her phone records, her travel history, and her precise relationship to my future son-in-law. I want to know what he orders for breakfast and where every single dollar he spends goes. I need a thorough, bulletproof dossier, and I needed it yesterday. Consider it done, sir, Garrett answered calmly. You'll have a preliminary report delivered securely to your desk within 48 hours. I ended the call and returned the phone to the safe. The wheels were in motion at last. Garrett would find the truth. He always did. Standing alone in the hushed office, I felt the adrenaline slowly drain away, leaving a hollow ache behind my sternum. My eyes settled on a framed photograph on my desk. It was Celeste, my late wife, cradling a very young Audrey in her arms. Celeste had been the undeniable light of my life. She carried a warmth and a gentleness of spirit I was never able to replicate in myself. In her final years, she had made it her mission to teach Audrey to find the good in every person she encountered. She raised our daughter to nurture empathy, to extend grace, and to place her faith in the better side of human nature. That deep empathy was precisely what made Audrey such a remarkable pediatrician today. It made her a generous, profoundly caring person. But now, in the most vicious twist of fate, I could imagine that same quality was being turned against her. Colt had recognized her open heart and cataloged it as nothing more than a weakness to exploit. He was turning my late wife's most beautiful lesson into the very blindfold keeping my daughter from seeing his true predatory nature. He was gambling on the certainty that Audrey would never suspect the man she loved of carrying such a cold, calculated, and malicious agenda. The image of Colt weaponizing Celeste's legacy to rob my daughter of her future lit a new, colder fire inside me. I wasn't simply going to stop a wedding. I was going to obliterate him completely. But to do that, I had to get through the hardest thing left to do that night. I had to leave the sanctuary of my office, return to the garden party, and perform the role of the proud, supportive father. I had to smile at the man who looked at my family and saw nothing but a financial opportunity. I had to shake his hand and make him believe that his pathetic lie about the Atlanta investor had landed without a scratch. If I let even a flicker of hostility or suspicion show, Colt might sense he was being watched. He might accelerate his plans, move to secure Audrey's assets ahead of schedule, or simply vanish before I could spring the trap. I needed him relaxed. I needed him to feel completely untouchable. I walked into the adjoining private bathroom and ran freezing water over my face. I held my own gaze in the mirror. I drew a slow, deliberate breath, smoothed my silk tie, and straightened my tailored suit jacket. I worked the tension out of my face, muscle by muscle, carefully constructing an expression of easy patriarchal warmth. I rehearsed a soft, welcoming smile. It was a terrifyingly convincing mask. I left the office and descended the grand sweeping staircase. The heavy front doors swung open, and the warm Texas night air folded around me. The garden was breathtaking. Thousands of white orchids draped elegantly over the iron archways. The gentle luminescence of hanging crystal chandeliers washed over the happy, celebrating faces of my closest friends and colleagues. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and pressing hands with practiced ease, projecting without a single crack the image of a man whose greatest joy was watching his daughter find her person. My eyes swept the manicured lawn until I located them. Audrey and Colt were standing near the towering 5-tiered engagement cake. I moved toward them. With deliberate calm, my terrifyingly composed smile locked firmly in place. "Vincent!" Colt called out as I drew close. He lifted his champagne glass in my direction, radiating an aura of relaxed, victorious ease. Did you manage to close that important deal on the phone? I stopped directly in front of him. I reached out and gripped his shoulder, delivering a firm, steady squeeze that communicated nothing but fatherly approval. I did, Colt, I said smoothly. It required some complex maneuvering, but the trap is officially set. The target has absolutely no idea what's coming. Colt laughed out loud, completely missing the dark, literal weight behind my words. That is exactly why you are a legend in this city, Vincent. You are always one step ahead of the competition. Audrey beamed, slipping her arm warmly through mine. I'm so relieved you're done working for the night, Dad. The event coordinator is about to call everyone together for the toasts. We really need you up there. I looked down at my beautiful, trusting daughter, my chest heavy with the enormous secret I was carrying. I wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart, I told her softly. I brought my gaze back to Colt, my smile never faltering. Let's go celebrate your future. The transition from the garden party to the Sunday dinner felt like a slow march toward the edge of a jagged cliff. Tradition called for us to gather at my estate every Sunday evening for a formal family meal. It was a beloved ritual my late wife Celeste had established decades ago, a way to keep us anchored no matter how turbulent our professional lives became. I had always treasured these dinners, but tonight, the long mahogany dining table felt like a psychological battlefield. The crystal glassware clinked softly. The polished silver caught the warm glow of the chandelier overhead, and my blood simmered just beneath the surface. Audrey sat to my right, looking radiant and utterly at ease, her hand resting affectionately over Colt's on the crisp white tablecloth. Colt sat directly across from me. He wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, projecting the effortless, unhurried charm of a man who was certain he held every winning card in a fixed game. He spent the first 20 minutes of the meal holding court, entertaining Audrey and my household staff with sweeping tales of his supposed corporate triumphs. He spoke fluidly about market disruption, leveraging synergistic paradigms, and revolutionizing the cloud infrastructure landscape. He deployed every hollow buzzword in the Silicon Valley playbook, constructing an elaborate picture of staggering success. Audrey watched him with pure adoration, her eyes bright with pride, as she listened to the man she believed was a visionary genius. I sat quietly at the head of the table, cutting my steak with slow, unhurried precision. I let him talk. I let him build his imaginary empire out of nothing. Over the past 40 years, I had negotiated with some of the most ruthless, brilliant, and deceptive corporate operators in the United States. I had sat across from calculating men who could bankrupt a major city without so much as a flinch. Through those decades, I had become fluent in reading micro-expressions long before behavioral experts ever put it into books. I knew the precise difference between the grounded stillness of a man speaking the truth and the hyperactive theater of a man peddling a manufactured lie. Colt was performing. His gestures ran slightly too broad and sweeping. His laughter landed a fraction too loud. He was constantly glancing at Audrey's face for validation, making sure his human shield remained firmly in place and fully mesmerized. When the dessert plates were cleared and fresh coffee was poured, I decided the moment had arrived to apply pressure. I folded my linen napkin, set it beside my plate, and leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. Colt, I said, my voice carrying a warm, grandfatherly curiosity that masked the lethal trap I was setting. I've been giving quite a bit of thought to your technology firm, Aerotech Solutions. That's right. You mentioned briefly at the engagement party that you're preparing for a major Series B funding round. Colt smiled broadly, lifting his black coffee for a confident sip. That is exactly right, Vincent. We are poised for truly exponential growth this quarter. The market indicators are incredibly strong right now, and our proprietary algorithms are drawing serious attention from major coastal investors. That's wonderful to hear, I replied warmly, my expression never shifting. I've always admired the speed and agility of the technology sector, quite a contrast to the slow grind of commercial real estate. Out of pure professional curiosity, how are you structuring your capitalizations table ahead of this new round? Are you working with participating preferred stock or standard convertible notes? I know firsthand how aggressive venture capital firms can be on anti-dilution provisions. If you're not extremely careful with your current burn rate, they could easily trigger a down round and wipe out your founder equity before you ever reach a public offering. The shift in his demeanor was instantaneous, though, invisible to any untrained eye. Audrey simply reached for her sparkling water, entirely oblivious to the heavy financial language being traded across the table. But Colt understood precisely what I was doing. This was not a polite fatherly question over dessert. I was demanding proof of life for his phantom company. For a fraction of a second, his charismatic mask slipped clean off. I watched the pupil of his left eye dilate with sudden alarm. I caught the tight-locked muscle along his jaw. A microscopic bead of sweat appeared at his hairline, catching the chandelier light. His mind was frantically scrambling, searching a mental database of business terminology that simply wasn't there. He had prepared thoroughly for surface-level questions about apps, servers, and software development. He had not prepared for the brutal granular mechanics of high-level venture capital financing. "That is a very insightful question, Vincent," Colt finally said. His voice held remarkably steady, but the pitch sat half an octave higher than it had been moments before. "We are currently in deep consultation with our legal team in Delaware to ensure the capitalization table is fully optimized for the incoming investors. We are leaning toward a hybrid model to shield our early seed investors while preserving our aggressive growth metrics. The details are legally dense at the moment, and I am strictly bound by non-disclosure agreements, but I assure you we have top-tier representation managing all the intricate mechanics." It was a masterful, desperate dodge. He deployed an enormous word salad to say absolutely nothing, wrapping his profound ignorance in the impenetrable, convenient armor of a non-disclosure agreement. To Audrey, it sounded like the prudent, responsible answer of a brilliant chief executive protecting his assets. To me, it sounded exactly like a man falling off a cliff, fingers clawing for anything solid on the way down. "Of course," I smiled, settling back slowly into my leather chair. "Discretion is everything in serious business. I would never ask you to violate a confidentiality agreement. I only wanted to be sure you were properly safeguarding what you've built. It would be a terrible, devastating shame to watch you raise such a magnificent company, only to have ruthless, greedy investors pull it right out from under you." The dark double meaning of those words hung heavily in the air between us. Colt swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. He reached blindly for his water glass knuckles, draining white as he gripped the heavy crystal. He took a long, slow drink, buying himself a few more precious seconds of composure before he had to respond. "Colt works so incredibly hard, Dad." Audrey chimed in, entirely misreading the suffocating tension that had settled over the dining room. She reached out and squeezed his arm. "I tell him all the time he needs to actually take a break. Once the wedding is behind us and the funding round is secured, I'm making him switch his phone off for 2 solid weeks on our honeymoon." "I'm really looking forward to it, sweetheart," Colt managed to say, offering her a tight, visibly strained smile that never reached his panicked eyes. The conversation drifted naturally away from business, steered along by Audrey's cheerful, relentless updates about the floral arrangements and the final seating chart for the reception. I joined in the wedding talk with flawless paternal enthusiasm. I nodded at precisely the right moments. I laughed warmly at precisely the right jokes. I played the role of the wealthy, devoted patriarch without a single detectable crack. But beneath the pleasant small talk and the fine dining, something in that room had shifted fundamentally and permanently. Colt was no longer holding court with supreme arrogance. He was no longer the loose, untouchable predator who had so casually mocked my daughter in my private library. He sat rigidly upright in his chair, picking absently at what remained on his plate, his eyes tracking nervously to me, across the table, again and again. He didn't know precisely what I had overheard the night before. He had no idea I'd already retained a ruthless private investigator to systematically tear his entire life apart. But he knew without question that I was testing him. He recognized the cold, calculating, unforgiving intelligence lurking just behind my grandfatherly smile. He had finally grasped what he'd missed entirely, that the clueless, trusting old man he'd so confidently planned to exploit was actually a seasoned apex predator who had just caught his scent. As the evening drew to its close and we gathered by the grand entrance to say our goodbyes, Colt extended his hand toward me, his palm faintly clammy against my skin. "Thank you for a truly wonderful dinner, Vincent," he said, forcing himself to hold direct eye contact. "It is always a pleasure to have you here, Colt," I replied, making certain my grip on his hand was just a fraction tighter than necessary. "Drive safely tonight. You have a very big, unpredictable future ahead of you." I stood in silence on the porch and watched his car swallow itself into the darkness at the far end of my long, sweeping driveway. The The psychological war had officially moved out of the shadows and into the open. I had fired my first warning shot straight across his bow, and the invisible clock was now ticking loudly. Colt Farrow was rattled and rattled. Desperate men always make catastrophic mistakes. I simply had to be ready to catch him when he inevitably fell. That Sunday dinner was only the opening move in what turned out to be a long week. I spent 3 days maintaining the flawless illusion of a contented father. I reviewed floral arrangements. I even allowed Colt to join me for a brief round of golf, letting him win by 2 strokes to artificially prop up his fragile ego. He performed the role of the respectful future son-in-law with practiced ease, but the underlying tension radiated off his posture like heat. The invisible walls were drawing in around him, and he could feel the pressure building. Thursday morning brought the waiting to an abrupt end. I was seated at my oak desk when my secure line rang. It was the front desk security guard. Garrett Pruitt was on his way up. I shut my laptop and waited. 2 minutes later, the heavy glass doors to my office swung open. Garrett walked straight across the room, with a thick leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His expression was completely grim, stripped of his usual professional detachment. "You were absolutely right to trust your instincts on this one, Vincent," Garrett said, dropping the portfolio squarely onto my desk. "The kid is a walking fraud, but the reality is considerably worse than we anticipated." I leaned forward and pulled it toward me. I opened the cover and found myself staring at a mountain of financial spreadsheets, offshore bank statements, and printed photographs. "Talk to me, Garrett," I said, my voice entirely flat. "Tell me exactly what I'm looking at." Garrett planted both hands on the edge of my solid oak desk. "Let's start with his magnificent technology empire." He began tapping a stack of incorporation documents. "Aerotech Solutions does not exist. It is a completely hollow shell company. No proprietary software, no engineering team, 0 functional product. The only thing he has is a rented virtual office in San Antonio. The entire venture is a meticulously constructed mirage." I stared at the stark documentation of his deception. A cold weight settled deep in my gut. "So he's a con artist," I said slowly. "He's been selling smoke and mirrors to bankroll a lavish lifestyle." "If only it were that simple," Garrett replied, shaking his head. "Running a con requires capital, and Colt burned through his own money 3 years ago. He is currently $4 million in debt." $4 million? I repeated it, my eyes moving across the highlighted financial ledgers. "To whom?" Garrett separated 2 stacks of documents. "It's a volatile mix," he explained. "The first $2 million is owed to a private equity firm out of New York. They provided seed funding based on fraudulent revenue projections. They have since uncovered the discrepancy and are preparing to pursue criminal fraud charges. They're going directly after his personal assets." "And the other $2 million?" I asked, feeling the air in the room grow thin. Garrett drew a slow, deliberate breath. "That is where things become genuinely dangerous. The other $2 million is owed to a syndicate of loan sharks operating out of Las Vegas. These are violent, unpredictable men, the kind who break kneecaps and burn houses down. Colt is severely delinquent on his payments. They've been breathing down his neck for months." I stared at the financial documents with a growing sense of horror. The picture forming in my mind had shifted violently. Colt wasn't simply a greedy parasite angling for a comfortable early retirement. He was a desperate drowning man. He had targeted Audrey because her $3 million trust fund was the only life raft capable of pulling him back from a violent end. He needed her money to settle with the syndicate before they made an example of him. "The only reason he's still walking around in one piece," Garrett continued quietly, "is because he showed those Vegas lenders the receipt for the engagement ring. He promised them he was marrying into the Mercer commercial real estate empire. He bought himself a few weeks of breathing room by using your family name as collateral." The sheer audacity of it made my blood ignite. He had leveraged my own daughter to rescue himself. "What else, Garrett?" I pressed. "You mentioned a woman in Miami." Garrett reached into the leather portfolio and withdrew a photograph, sliding it carefully across the desk. It showed Colt standing on the deck of a luxury yacht in Miami. He was holding a glass of champagne, his arm locked around the waist of a stunning blonde woman. "That is Sable," Garrett stated simply. "She is a 24-year-old social media model. He has been secretly wiring her $30,000 a month for the past year to sustain her lifestyle in Florida. He runs the transactions through an offshore account in the Cayman Islands to keep them hidden from his creditors." I studied the photograph with care, taking in every detail. The woman was beautiful, but there was something else. She wore a form-fitting sundress, and her stomach was very visibly rounded. I pressed a trembling finger against the photograph. "Is she pregnant?" Garrett nodded. "Yes, 4 months along. According to medical records I was able to obtain, it's a boy. Colt is the registered father. He is actively building an entirely separate family in Florida using the money he intends to steal from Audrey." I settled back into my heavy leather chair. The office fell into an absolute crushing silence. The picture was complete. The full scope of his betrayal was so vast, so profoundly evil, it nearly defied comprehension. He intended to marry my trusting daughter, drain her entire financial future, to pay off violent creditors, then leave her behind and raise a child with his mistress in Miami. He had reduced Audrey to nothing more than a financial transaction. I closed my eyes for a long moment, organizing the storm of fury inside me into something cold and razor-sharp. I could not allow him to walk away intact. I had to obliterate his ability to harm anyone ever again. I had to strip him of every resource he possessed. "Garrett," I said, opening my eyes and fixing him with a gaze that held not a trace of mercy. "I want every piece of contact information you can find for the private equity firm in New York and the lending syndicate in Las Vegas. Get me the names of their primary decision makers. Don't reach out to them yourself. Just give me the numbers." Garrett looked at me, a flicker of deep understanding crossing his face. "You're not simply going to break off the engagement, are you?" "No," I replied, lifting the photograph of Colt and his pregnant mistress. "Violence is a cheap temporary solution. I am going to purchase his debt. I am going to become his sole creditor, and then I am going to bury him so thoroughly in financial ruin that he will never see daylight again. Get Conrad Whitfield on the line immediately. It is time to set a trap." I sat perfectly still as Garrett left the office, leaving me alone with the devastating truth spread across my desk. I reached for my phone to call Conrad Whitfield, fully prepared to begin acquiring Colt's massive debt. I was ready to become his worst nightmare, but before I could dial a single digit, my private office line rang. The caller ID displayed a name that made my chest tighten instantly. It was Audrey. I drew a slow, steadying breath, smoothed the sharp edges of rage from my voice, and answered. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, settling back into my heavy leather chair. "How is your morning going at the hospital?" "It has been incredibly hectic, Dad," Audrey replied. Her voice carried exhaustion, but unmistakable happiness. "We had 3 premature deliveries before noon, but everyone is stable now. I am actually catching a rare break. I wanted to see if you had time for a quick lunch near the clinic. There is something important I need to run by you." That word "important" set off an immediate blaring alarm somewhere deep in my chest. "Of course," I told her. "I will be there in 20 minutes. I gathered the damning photographs and financial ledgers, locking them back securely inside my wall safe. I left the building and drove across downtown Houston, my mind cycling through a dozen terrible possibilities. When I pulled up to the quiet upscale cafe near the hospital, Audrey was already seated at a corner table. She had her white medical coat on over a simple blue dress, and she looked so much like her late mother that the sight of her physically ached. I settled into the chair across from her and offered a warm, fatherly smile. "What is on your mind, sweetheart?" I asked, flagging down the passing waiter for a black coffee. "Is everything all right with the wedding preparations?" "Everything is perfect, Dad," she beamed, folding her hands on the table. "Actually, this is about our financial future. Colt has been incredibly proactive lately. He met with a specialized estate planner yesterday and came to me with what he called a really brilliant idea." I felt the blood leave my face, but I held my smile absolutely frozen in place. "Is that right?" I asked, keeping my voice smooth. "What sort of idea did Colt propose?" Audrey leaned in, her eyes glowing with complete trust and admiration. She explained that Colt was deeply concerned about safeguarding her assets. He had told her that because his technology firm was entering a high valuation phase ahead of a massive funding round, he wanted to fully shield her trust fund from any potential corporate liabilities. His suggestion was that by signing a joint asset amendment to their prenuptial agreement, they could bring their portfolios together under a specific legal umbrella. He claimed this move would not only protect her money, but dramatically optimize their combined tax bracket, saving them millions over time. My stomach turned violently. It was a masterpiece of financial manipulation. Colt had taken an aggressively predatory legal maneuver and dressed it up in the warm language of love and protection. He was using his manufactured success as a blindfold. I knew precisely what that specific legal umbrella actually meant. It was a collateral access mechanism. The instant Audrey signed that amendment, her isolated trust fund would become a joint marital asset. Colt would gain immediate unrestricted legal authority to borrow against her $3 million. He would drain her money to pay off the violent Las Vegas loan sharks currently hunting him down and leave my daughter responsible for every dollar of his criminal debt. That does sound very complex, I said carefully, keeping my tone one of mild fatherly curiosity. When exactly are you planning to execute this amendment? This afternoon, Audrey answered casually, taking a sip of her iced tea. We have an appointment with the notary at 4:00. Colt said it is better to get the paperwork done now so we can focus entirely on the wedding next week. I glanced at my watch. It was 1:00 in the afternoon. I had exactly 3 hours to stop my daughter from handing her entire future to a desperate drowning predator. Every instinct told me to slam my fist onto the table and lay out the truth. I wanted her to know about the loan sharks, the phantom company, and the pregnant mistress living in Miami, but I thought of the absolute adoration in her eyes. I thought of how deeply she loved this man. If I shattered her world right here in a public cafe without any preparation, the shock could break her completely. And if she went straight to Colt with my accusations, he would know immediately that I was investigating him. He would panic, flee the state, and slip clear of the devastating and inescapable trap I was still in the process of building. I needed to stall the signing, but to do it, I would have to use a lie of my own. Audrey, sweetheart, I began, dropping my voice to a quiet conspiratorial level. I was actually planning to keep this completely secret until the rehearsal dinner, but you are forcing my hand early. Audrey looked puzzled. A small furrow crossed her brow. Keep what a secret, Dad? I reached across the table and gently took her hands in mine. I am putting together a substantial financial wedding gift for the two of you. I lied without a flinch, drawing on 40 years of boardroom composure. It involves a complex transfer of commercial real estate assets directly into your primary trust fund. My legal team has been working on it for weeks. If you sign any joint asset amendments today, it will completely alter your tax classification and trigger massive immediate federal tax penalties on the gift I am trying to give you. It would be a catastrophic logistical disaster. Audrey's eyes went wide with genuine surprise. Dad, you do not have to give us anything more. You are already paying for this entire beautiful wedding. I want to do this, I insisted, pouring every bit of fatherly devotion I had into my gaze. But I need a very big favor from you. I need you to leave your trust fund entirely untouched and unamended for the next 30 days. Let my attorneys finish their work. Once the wedding is behind us and things settle down, you and Colt can restructure your finances however you like. Can you do that for me? Can you postpone the signing? Audrey smiled warmly, visibly moved by my fabricated generosity. She squeezed my hands in return. Of course, Dad. I had no idea you were doing all of that. I will text Colt right now and let him know we need to cancel the appointment with the notary. She took her phone from her purse and quickly typed out a message. I sat perfectly still watching her screen. Fewer than 30 seconds later, 3 gray typing dots appeared. Colt was responding. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of that connection. Colt was sitting somewhere in the city, drenched in sweat, staring at his phone in sheer unfiltered panic. His violent creditors were demanding their money, and his guaranteed lifeline had just been yanked away at the very last possible second. He says the lawyer is going to charge a cancellation fee, she told me, already typing her reply. I just told him it does not matter, and that we absolutely must wait until after the honeymoon. He is a little disappointed because he wanted everything neatly organized, but he says he understands completely. I took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee, masking the cold, predatory satisfaction flooding through me. Colt did not understand at all. He was simply terrified. He had launched a preemptive strike to seize my daughter's wealth, and he had failed. He was now backed into a tight corner with no clear exit. The Las Vegas syndicate would not wait until after the honeymoon. They wanted their $2 million immediately. I finished lunch with my beautiful daughter, listening as she talked excitedly about her dress fittings and the upcoming honeymoon to Bora Bora. Every smile she gave me hardened my resolve a little further, like steel cooling in water. I walked her back to the entrance of the pediatric clinic, kissed her gently on the forehead, and watched her disappear through the sliding glass doors. The moment she was out of sight, I pulled my secure phone from my breast pocket. The time for playing defense had officially come to an end. It was time to move on the offensive. I dialed Conrad Whitfield, my primary corporate attorney, as I walked briskly back to my waiting car. "Conrad," I said the moment he picked up, "I need you to draft a highly specialized investment contract immediately. We are going to offer Colt Farrow $10 million, but the terms need to be absolutely lethal. I want a blanket lien placed on every single asset he currently holds." I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel hard. The trap was finally set. I sat alone in the car for several minutes. The steady hum of the engine was the only sound cutting through the heavy silence. My corporate attorney was already moving with ruthless efficiency to draft the lethal investment contract. But the feeling of total control was abruptly shattered by a sharp vibration from my secure phone. It was Garrett. The private investigator had just intercepted a deeply alarming digital communication. Colt was not accepting the delay. Audrey had texted him earlier to cancel their afternoon appointment with the estate planner, but Colt was far too desperate to simply accept that answer. The violent lending syndicate in Las Vegas had just handed him a strict, non-negotiable deadline. He needed liquid collateral immediately. Garrett informed me that Colt had secretly dispatched a mobile notary directly to the pediatric clinic. He was planning to ambush Audrey between her patient consultations. His plan was to pressure her into signing the joint asset amendment under the cover of a last-minute wedding emergency. The sheer unfiltered audacity of it made my jaw clench until my teeth ached. He was actively trying to go around my intervention and manipulate her inside her own workplace. I dropped the car into gear and pulled into the heavy flow of downtown traffic, merging with a cold, aggressive purpose. I pointed the car toward Houston Medical Center with a singular, icy focus. I moved through the familiar congested streets of Houston, my mind turning over every possible variable. I had to reach the clinic before that notary. I had to shield her without yet exposing the full, ugly truth. When I reached the sprawling medical complex, I skipped the main visitor lot and left my car in the restricted executive zone. I pushed through the automatic sliding doors, the sharp bite of antiseptic hitting my lungs immediately. The pediatric wing sat on the third floor of the main building. I stepped off the elevator into a bright, humming corridor, painted in soft, calming pastels. The contrast between that nurturing environment and the dark, predatory world Colt occupied was genuinely jarring. This was a place of healing and pure innocence. I walked toward the central nurses' station and stopped. Through the large viewing window of a treatment room, I found my daughter. Audrey was perched on a low stool beside a small hospital bed, speaking softly to a pale, frightened little boy clutching a stuffed animal. I watched her reach out and gently brush a loose strand of hair from his forehead, her face radiating a boundless, effortless compassion. She looked up at the exhausted parents standing close by and offered them the kind of deep, genuine reassurance that no amount of money could replicate. My chest swelled with fierce protective pride. My late wife had raised a truly extraordinary human being. Audrey carried a soul so bright and so giving that it drew people to her naturally. But that same beautiful light had drawn in a dangerous parasite. Colt did not love her. He had no interest in her brilliant mind or her endless empathy. To him, she was a convenient target, a vehicle for clearing his massive gambling debts and funding a comfortable life with his pregnant mistress in Miami. Watching her tend to those sick children, any last trace of paternal hesitation drained from me completely. My resolve turned to cold, unforgiving steel. Simply dissolving the engagement and calling off the extravagant wedding was no longer an acceptable outcome. Removing Colt from her life would protect her for now, but it would not settle the scales of justice. If I simply drove him away, he would find another trusting, wealthy woman to prey on. He would keep destroying lives, leaving a wide trail of financial ruin and emotional wreckage behind him. In that moment, I decided it wasn't enough to remove him. I had to completely obliterate his capacity to ever harm anyone again. I would take his freedom, his reputation, and every last piece of his future. I pulled my attention from the treatment room, just as a man in a cheap gray suit stepped off the elevator. He carried a thick leather briefcase and scanned the pediatric ward with nervous, darting eyes. I recognized the uneasy shuffle of a man on an errand he knew wasn't clean. It was the mobile notary Colt had dispatched. I cut him off before he could reach the reception desk. I stepped squarely into his path, blocking his view of my daughter's clinic. "Excuse me?" I said. my voice carrying the quiet, unmistakable authority of a man who held the deeds to half the commercial buildings in the downtown district. "You are here for Dr. Audrey Mercer." The notary blinked visibly, thrown by my sudden imposing presence. "Yes, sir," he said with a slight stammer, adjusting his grip on the briefcase. "I have urgent legal documents that require her immediate signature on a prenuptial amendment." I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder and turned him smoothly back toward the waiting elevators. "I am Vincent Mercer," I said, plainly letting the weight of that name settle over him like a hand pressed to the chest. "I am her father. My daughter is in there treating critically ill children, and she will not be interrupted for any reason. Beyond that, the documents you are carrying are no longer valid. My legal team is restructuring the financial arrangement tied to a corporate gift. If she signs those papers today, it will trigger catastrophic federal tax penalties. You will go back to whoever hired you and tell them the signing is postponed indefinitely. Are we clear?" The notary swallowed hard. He knew immediately he was entirely out of his depth. He gave a quick nod and retreated into the elevator without a single word of protest. I watched the doors close and the threat disappear with them. I drew a slow breath and walked back toward the treatment room. Audrey emerged a few minutes later, tired but visibly fulfilled. She looked up and broke into a startled smile. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, stepping forward and pulling me into a warm hug. "I just wanted to see my favorite doctor," I replied smoothly, holding her close. "And I wanted to make certain you had canceled that notary appointment in person. My banking team is working around the clock on your wedding gift, and we cannot afford any legal complications right now." Audrey shook her head with an affectionate smile. "You are entirely too much, Dad." "Yes, I told Colt we have to wait." He pushed back a little, said the notary was already on his way, but I held firm. I told him, "My father comes first and his gift requires patience." I kissed her forehead, keeping the satisfaction in my chest completely hidden. "You are a smart woman, sweetheart," I murmured. I walked with her toward the break room, listening to her phone ring steadily in her pocket. It was Colt, frantically trying to salvage his collapsing lifeline, but it was already too late. I had cut off his access to her trust fund. He was now completely isolated, drowning in violent debt, desperate for a miracle. Tomorrow, I would invite him to my office and offer him exactly the miracle he was looking for. The following morning settled over the city with the thick, oppressive heat that Houston was known for. I stepped into the private elevator of my downtown headquarters at exactly 7:00. The quiet mechanical hum lifting me 40 floors above the city matched the measured rhythm of my thoughts. I was not simply stopping a wedding today. I was about to surgically dismantle a predator who had genuinely believed he could use my family as a financial shield. When the elevator doors parted into my executive suite, Conrad Whitfield was already there waiting. In the private boardroom spread across the long mahogany table sat a stack of dense, imposing documents. I poured myself a black coffee and took a seat across from him. Conrad slid the thickest folder in my direction. "It is exactly as you requested, Vincent," he said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "This is a 60-page investment agreement for a $10 million capital injection into Aerotech Solutions. The financial language reads as standard for a mezzanine funding round, but the collateral clauses buried in Section 4 are absolutely draconian. We have included a comprehensive blanket line. If Colt Farrow accepts this money, he is legally pledging his company, his personal bank accounts, his luxury vehicles, his condominium, and any future earnings as collateral. There is also an immediate default trigger. Any act of moral turpitude, fraud, or extortion renders the entire debt payable on demand. If he defaults, you hold the unilateral right to seize every asset he owns without the need for prolonged litigation." I turned through the dense pages of legal language. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. A legitimate businessman would never put his name on a document like this without a team of aggressive lawyers spending a month pulling it to pieces. But Colt was not a legitimate businessman. He was a terrified drowning con artist who owed $2 million to violent loan sharks and needed liquid capital to save his own life before the wedding. He was completely out of time. "Thank you, Conrad," I murmured, closing the folder. "Have security clear Mr. Farrow for entry. I am expecting him at 10:00. I had kept my tone on the phone with Colt, warm and generous, playing the role of the proud, supportive patriarch to absolute perfection. I told him I had a major surprise connected to the upcoming nuptials and insisted he come to my office alone. When Colt walked through my double doors 3 hours later, the strain of his hidden panic was plainly written on him. The skin around his eyes was drawn tight, and the effortless, arrogant swagger he had carried into my library just days ago was noticeably absent. The failed notary ambush at the pediatric clinic had clearly shaken him. He knew the Las Vegas syndicate was tightening its grip, and his primary escape route had been blocked. He was running low on time and options. "Vincent, thank you for having me. Colt said, manufacturing a bright, easy smile as he crossed the wide expanse of my office. He extended his hand. "Your assistant mentioned a wedding surprise." I rose from my desk and took his hand with a firm, warm grip, making no acknowledgement of the faint dampness in his palm. "Please, have a seat, Colt." I crossed to the private bar tucked in the corner of the room. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Something a little stronger to mark the occasion. Sparkling water would be perfect, actually." "Thank you," he said, settling into one of the plush leather chairs across from my desk. I leaned forward, elbows on the polished surface, projecting an aura of complete and unshakable trust. "Colt." I began, my voice soft and soaked in manufactured warmth. "I owe you an apology. At the engagement party, and again at our Sunday dinner, I was throwing around some fairly aggressive questions about your technology firm. I realize I probably came across as the classic overbearing father who believes nobody is quite worthy of his daughter. Not at all, Vincent. You are protecting your family. I have nothing but respect for that. I would do the exact same thing if our positions were reversed." I let a look of genuine paternal warmth settle over my face. "Well, your patience and your devotion to Audrey have truly won me over. I can see how deeply she loves you, and I can see how hard you are working to build Aerotech Solutions into something real. But I also understand the brutal realities of the technology sector. Raising capital ahead of a funding round can be an absolute nightmare. Venture capital firms want your equity, your board seats, and your independence. I have no interest in watching my son-in-law lose the company he built from nothing simply because he needed growth capital." Colt was watching me closely, his breathing shallow, his mind working furiously to follow where this conversation was leading. That is precisely why I continued keeping my tone perfectly measured. I have decided to step in myself. I want to make certain you and Audrey begin your marriage standing on solid financial ground. As my personal wedding gift to the two of you, I am going to bypass the venture capital circuit entirely. I am going to put $10 million directly into Aerotech Solutions myself. The crystal glass shifted in Colt's hand. He caught it just before it tipped, setting it on the coaster, with fingers that weren't entirely steady. He looked at me with wide, unbelieving eyes. $10 million. For a man already suffocating beneath $4 million dangerous debt, I had just dangled the ultimate lifeline. "Vincent," he stammered, his polished exterior cracking under the sheer pull of his own greed. "I am completely speechless. That is an extraordinarily generous offer. I genuinely do not know what to say." "You do not need to say anything," I replied with an easy smile. "You simply need to look over the paperwork." I reached into my desk drawer and produced the thick 60-page contract Conrad had prepared. I set it down on the desk. The solid thud it made landing on the polished wood seemed to fill the room. It was the physical embodiment of his ruin, neatly assembled in a premium leather portfolio. "There is just one small catch," I said, giving a casual wave as though the contract were nothing more than a minor administrative formality. "Because this involves a significant transfer of personal capital, my legal team insisted on some standard protective measures. It is entirely procedural. The contract carries a blanket lien against your business and personal assets. What it means in practical terms is that until the company hits its projected revenue targets next year, your assets serve as collateral for the $10 million. It shields me from federal gift tax exposure and keeps the corporate auditors satisfied. Once the wedding is behind us and the company goes public, we dissolve the lien completely." Colt stared down at the imposing stack of dense legal paper. His eyes moved back and forth between the document and my face. Any legitimate executive would have immediately asked for a week to have counsel tear through every clause. A real founder would have recoiled at the idea of pledging his personal condominium and bank accounts against corporate funding. But Colt was not a legitimate executive. He was simply desperate. Colt sat frozen in the chair across from my desk, his eyes scanning the opening page. He was a predator by nature, accustomed to controlling every room he entered, bending conversations with effortless charm. But here inside my corporate fortress, he was well outside his element. He touched the paper tracing the edge of the seal. $10 million was a staggering sum. It was more than enough to silence the loan sharks closing in on him from Las Vegas. It was enough to settle his fraudulent accounts with the equity firm in New York. It was the perfect escape hatch for a man buckling under the weight of his own deceptions. But accepting it meant stepping into a financial cage I had constructed with the sole purpose of destroying him. I watched his throat work as he swallowed. He turned to the fourth section, skimming the paragraphs that detailed the blanket lien. I could see his jaw tighten as he read the clauses tying his luxury condominium, his vehicles, his business assets, and his offshore accounts to the funding. Conrad had drafted something so punishing, it left virtually no room for maneuvering. "Is there a problem, Colt?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle, unhurried, and paternal. "If the collateral requirements make you uncomfortable, we can absolutely delay the investment. I can have Conrad draft a traditional equity arrangement instead, but that will require a full board review. We would be looking at 3 or 4 months to complete the transfer and clear the auditing process." I leaned back in my chair and glanced at my watch, every inch of my posture radiating casual indifference. I had simply thought it would be a meaningful gesture to have the funds sitting in your accounts before the wedding next week. It would let you focus entirely on Audrey and your honeymoon, rather than chasing venture capital. The mention of a 4-month delay hit him like a current of electricity. His violent creditors were not going to wait 4 months. They weren't going to wait 4 days. He needed liquid cash in hand immediately to save his kneecaps, or worse, his life. The comfortable illusion he had built was fracturing, and the consequences of his choices were pressing in close. "I do not want to delay anything, Vincent," he said quickly. His voice caught for just a moment before he smoothed it back into something resembling composure. "I am just making sure I fully understand the mechanics of these default triggers. This language feels unusually aggressive for a family investment. It references the immediate seizure of all listed assets without arbitration in the event of moral turpitude or fraudulent behavior." I offered him a reassuring chuckle. "Oh, that is just Conrad being overly cautious about my commercial estate," I said, brushing the concern away with a relaxed gesture. "Corporate attorneys always draft for the worst imaginable scenario. It is what they are paid to do. They write those aggressive clauses to guard my portfolio against hostile takeovers or criminal negligence. You and I both know you are a brilliant principled founder. You love my daughter, and you are building a legitimate company. A moral turpitude clause is only a threat to a man who intends to commit fraud. Are you planning to commit fraud against me, Colt?" I held his gaze with a warm, unhurried smile, the perfectly assembled expression of a trusting patriarch. The question hung in the still air of my office. It was a lethal challenge dressed in the clothes of a light-hearted joke. If he pushed back too hard on the clause, he would signal clearly that he had something criminal to conceal. His own fabricated persona had him completely cornered. Colt produced a laugh that came out noticeably hollow and brittle. "Of course not, Vincent. My integrity is the most valuable asset I have in any business relationship. I am simply accustomed to running documents of this scale past my own legal team before putting my name on them. Perhaps I should forward this to my attorneys in Delaware for a quick compliance check before we proceed." I gave an easy shrug, my composure entirely undisturbed. "You are completely free to do that, Colt. I would never push you to execute a financial agreement you have not had properly reviewed. That said, I am flying out tomorrow morning for a major commercial symposium in London. If we do not close the investment agreement today, my capital will be held in international escrow until I return late next month. The decision is entirely yours. We can simply wait until I am back." The trap was completely set. The $10 million bait hung right before his eyes, while the relentless clock of his own debts hammered in his ears. I watched greed and raw terror battle one another across his face. He looked down at the 60-page contract resting on the edge of my desk. He looked at the heavy gold pen lying beside it. I knew exactly what was moving through his mind. He had no legal team in Delaware. He had no innovative software product worth protecting. All he had was the crushing, terrifying reality of $4 million owed to men who did not accept excuses. Colt reached out and lifted the gold pen. He did not read another line of the contract. He turned straight to the signature pages at the very back of the thick binder. With a hand that trembled just slightly, he signed his name on the dotted line. He signed away his luxury condominium, Before I show you what happened, when Colt finally sat across from me and picked up that pen and what it would truly cost him the moment he did, let me ask you this. If someone you loved was being hunted by a person wearing a perfect smile, would you warn them immediately, or would you wait and build a case they could never escape? He signed away his fleet of expensive cars. He signed away the hidden offshore accounts where he had stashed money pilfered from previous investors. He signed away everything that remained of his future, legally chaining himself to a punishing contract engineered for the sole purpose of his complete destruction. I watched the black ink settle into the thick paper, a deep, icy satisfaction taking hold somewhere in the center of my chest. The predator was cornered. "Welcome to the family, Colt," I said, warm and easy. I reached across the wide mahogany desk and shook his hand one last time. He smiled back the look of a man who believed he had just been handed a reprieve and set the pen down. "When can I expect the investment funds to be wired?" he asked, unable to fully scrub the raw, gnawing hunger from his voice. I drew the signed contract toward me and closed the leather cover with care. "It is a significant transfer," I explained. "Federal banking regulations require a mandatory compliance review on any domestic wire exceeding $5 million. The funds should be sitting in your accounts by next Wednesday, just a few days before the ceremony." I caught the briefest flash of unfiltered panic cross his face. Next Wednesday was nowhere near soon enough. He needed that money today. He had just locked himself into my financial cage, but his immediate crisis remained entirely unsolved. He got to his feet, working the buttons of his tailored jacket with unsteady fingers. He thanked me in a torrent of words before moving quickly through the heavy oak door. He had no idea that the desperate urgency driving him would push him toward a federal crime that would seal his destruction once and for all. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, and I was left alone in the deep quiet of my executive office. Colt Farrow was riding the elevator down to the lobby at that very moment, gripping a leather-bound contract he believed was his salvation. In truth, he was carrying a ticking charge. The $10 million I had promised him was entirely real, but the procedural delay I had invented was the actual weapon. I had deliberately engineered a 5-day window in which he would be legally bound to my draconian collateral terms while remaining completely without the liquid cash he needed to satisfy his violent creditors. I understood precisely how desperate men behaved when the walls closed in with no exit visible. They reacted to the most immediate threat in front of them. For Colt, that threat was the Las Vegas lending syndicate. Garrett Pruitt had briefed me that morning that the syndicate had officially exhausted their patience. They had handed Colt a firm, non-negotiable ultimatum: deliver $2 million within 48 hours, or they would begin dismantling his life in ways that were very physical and entirely irreversible. Presenting them with my signed investment contract might have purchased a brief extension at another time, but loan sharks did not accept corporate paperwork as currency. The 48 hours that followed were an exercise in iron psychological discipline as I moved through my normal daily routine with deliberate, unhurried precision. Beneath that composed surface, I was simply waiting for the inevitable break. I was waiting for Colt to realize that the walls would crush him long before my promised wire transfer ever arrived. On Friday afternoon, the break came. I was in my private study at the estate, working through a quarterly tax projection, when my secure phone lit up. The name on the screen was Aldwell, my primary wealth manager at the federal bank, the man who had overseen the Mercer family trust for more than 2 decades. Aldwell never reached my personal encrypted line unless a matter demanded immediate, highly sensitive authorization. I straightened in my chair before I even answered. Mr. Mercer Aldwell began, his tone clipped and professional, but carrying a low current of urgent concern. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have a highly irregular compliance issue involving Audrey's primary trust account." My pulse dropped to a slow, cold, deliberate beat. Approximately 20 minutes ago, Aldwell explained, Colt Farrow entered our downtown branch. He presented a fully executed joint asset authorization amendment, legally merging his financial portfolio with Audrey's trust. Attached to the amendment was an expedited collateral withdrawal request. He is attempting to pull $2 million in liquid cash against the primary trust balance. The audacity of the move was breathtaking. He had sidestepped the notary ambush, bypassed the legal waiting period, and walked directly into a federal financial institution to empty my daughter's account. Did Audrey accompany him to the branch? I asked, my voice dropping to something quiet and absolute. Mr. Farrow indicated that she was in surgery at the pediatric clinic and could not be reached. However, the joint asset amendment he submitted carries her physical signature and the stamp of a licensed public notary. On the surface, the documentation appears entirely legitimate, which is why it cleared the initial teller review. Given the size of the withdrawal and its proximity to the wedding, our internal risk protocols required me to place a temporary hold on the transfer until I had spoken with you. I sat perfectly motionless, staring at the polished grain of my desk. I had spoken to Audrey just the previous day. She had given me her explicit word that she would not execute any joint asset amendments until my fabricated corporate gift was finalized after the honeymoon. My daughter does not break promises to me. Aldwell, I said, selecting each word with precise deliberation. My daughter is working a grueling shift at the hospital today. She has not signed any legal documents, and she has certainly not authorized a $2 million withdrawal for a venture capital closing. The full weight of what I had just said settled between us. Mr. Mercer, if Audrey did not sign this joint asset amendment, then the signature on this federal banking document is a direct forgery. Mr. Farrow has submitted falsified legal instruments to a federally insured institution in order to extract $2 million. That is a Class B federal felony. It constitutes serious wire fraud and bank fraud. I settled back into my chair and let a profound, icy satisfaction move through me. Colt had crossed the point of no return. He had gambled that his surface-level charm and the fast-approaching wedding date would push the bank through its standard verification protocols before anyone looked too closely. He had just handed me the final nail for his own coffin. "What are your instructions?" Sir Aldwell asked, his voice taut with expectation. "Shall I contact the federal authorities and have him detained in the branch lobby?" "No," I replied immediately. "Do not alert him. If you take him into custody now, he will call it a desperate misunderstanding. He will retain a defense attorney and drag this through litigation for years. I intend to see him completely destroyed on my own terms, in a manner that leaves him with no angle of escape." I rose and began to pace the length of my study. "I need you to formally reject the withdrawal request, Aldwell. Tell Colt that the transfer failed a secondary compliance review due to international tax hold regulations. Tell him the funds cannot be cleared until late next week. Give him a sufficiently technical bureaucratic explanation, something he cannot reasonably dispute. Let him leave the bank believing the transaction was simply delayed, not uncovered." "Understood, sir." "And the forged documents, secure them in your primary vault," I instructed. "Scan high-resolution copies of every page along with his physical identification records and the security footage of him presenting the forged amendment to the teller. Send all of those encrypted files directly to my personal corporate attorney, Conrad Whitfield. We are going to need that evidence, and we are going to need it to be airtight." "I will take care of it immediately, Mr. Mercer." I ended the call and set the phone on my desk. The silence in my study was total. The trap had officially closed. Colt Farrow had committed a significant federal crime, and I held every piece of proof needed to prove it. He was walking out of that bank empty-handed at this very moment, stepping back into the sweltering Houston heat, with the dawning realization that his violent creditors were still coming to collect. He had failed to drain my daughter's account. He had run out of moves, but I was far from finished. Simply allowing the loan sharks to break his legs was a crude temporary punishment. I wanted total structured permanent ruin. I picked up the phone again and dialed Conrad Whitfield. It was time to execute the final invisible maneuver. It was time to quietly purchase his debt and become his ultimate creditor. I put the call through on my secure line. The connection opened with a clean click, and I dispensed with any introduction. "Conrad, I need you to initiate a hostile debt acquisition." "Immediately," I said, my voice steady in the silence of my study. "Colt Farrow owes $4 million. $2 million is held by a private equity firm in New York, and the remaining $2 million is controlled by an unsavory lending syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. I want ownership of every cent of that debt by tomorrow morning." Conrad was a man who had steered billion-dollar mergers without breaking stride. Even so, I heard a measured pause on his end. "Acquiring distressed debt from a legitimate firm is straightforward enough, Vincent," he replied, weighing his words. "But purchasing paper from a Las Vegas gambling syndicate is a highly irregular matter. They do not operate through standard corporate channels. They operate for profit," I countered evenly. "Money is the only language they understand. Route the offer through one of our blind shell corporations in Delaware to keep my identity shielded. Offer the New York firm a 10% premium on the principal balance to accelerate the transfer. They are already preparing to take him to court. They will be more than happy to unload a toxic asset without absorbing the cost of prolonged litigation. As for the syndicate wire, the funds through our offshore intermediaries. Tell them a silent partner is assuming the exposure and paying them owed in full in cash within 24 hours. They do not care who holds the note as long as they receive their money. I understand the mechanics, Conrad said, the sound of his keyboard already moving in the background. But I have to ask, why are we doing it this way? He just committed federal forgery. You could hand the banking evidence to the authorities tonight and have him in custody before dinner. Because an arrest is only a pause, I said, looking out across the Houston skyline spread below my window. If I simply deliver him to law enforcement, he will declare bankruptcy. He will scrub his financial record clean from a prison cell. When he eventually walks out, he will have nothing, but he will owe nothing either. I refuse to extend him that convenience. I intend to own his financial future permanently. The moment he breached the moral turpitude clause in the investment contract he signed in my office, he triggered a legal default. By acquiring his debt outright, I become his sole and absolute creditor. I am not merely putting him in a cage, Conrad. I am going to build it from his own greed and keep the only key. The line went quiet for a beat before Conrad exhaled a sound carrying a note of deep professional respect. I will have the acquisition papers finalized by morning. Consider it done. The 48 hours that followed were a masterpiece of invisible corporate maneuvering, while Colt frantically wore down the hardwood floors of his rented luxury condominium, desperately searching for a way to pacify his violent creditors. My legal team moved with ruthless, devastating precision. The private equity firm in New York accepted our premium offer within 3 hours. They transferred the original promissory notes electronically, washing their hands of Colt Farrow without a second thought. The Las Vegas syndicate demanded slightly more finesse. They were deeply suspicious of the sudden anonymous buyout, but raw greed ultimately overrode their paranoia. When Conrad wired $2 million in clean, untraceable funds through a corporate proxy, they surrendered the debt. They handed over the illicit lending contracts, effectively transferring complete ownership of Colt's financial life directly into my waiting hands. By Thursday afternoon, a thick leather binder arrived by private courier to my executive office. I sat alone at my mahogany desk and opened the heavy cover. Inside lay the legally binding documents transferring every dollar of Colt's $4 million debt to my personal holding company. He was entirely, completely mine. He had no idea that the loan sharks he had been desperately hiding from no longer had any claim on him. He had no idea that the corporate attorneys preparing to sue him had already walked away from the case. He believed he was still fighting a desperate war across multiple invisible fronts, blind to the reality that I had already quietly taken the entire battlefield. Later that evening, another deeply unsettling update arrived from Garrett Pruitt. The private investigator had continued monitoring Colt's digital communications. Colt was coming apart. The Las Vegas syndicate had gone completely silent, no replies to his frantic messages, a sudden menacing stillness that he almost certainly read as the calm before a violent physical reckoning. Gripped by sheer unfiltered panic, he had reached out to his pregnant mistress in Miami. He promised her a massive influx of capital was on its way, and told her to begin packing for an extended international trip. He was actively making plans to leave the country the moment my fictional $10 million investment cleared his accounts. I studied the surveillance photographs Garrett had transmitted, Colt nervously loading expensive luggage into the trunk of his car. He was preparing to abandon my daughter at the altar entirely. His plan was to let her discover his disappearance on their wedding day, leaving her standing humiliated before our entire social circle, while he slipped away to a tropical destination with her stolen wealth. The cold, calculated cruelty of his contingency plan extinguished whatever remained of any mercy I might have carried. I placed the finalized debt acquisition documents into my leather briefcase alongside the irrefutable evidence of his federal bank forgery. The trap was now perfectly assembled, precisely calibrated, fully armed, and loaded with lethal intent. I had isolated the predator, systematically severed every financial lifeline he possessed, and quietly purchased the very ground beneath his feet. Tomorrow was the rehearsal dinner. The event was scheduled at the Post Oak Hotel, an opulent gathering designed to celebrate the union of two prominent families. 100 of the most influential, powerful people in Houston would fill that grand ballroom drinking exceptional champagne and toasting to a bright future. Colt would be there, in a custom-tailored tuxedo, working his bright practice smile, performing the role of the devoted, adoring groom. He would stand confidently before my daughter, my closest friends and my most trusted associates, entirely certain that his elaborate web of deceptions was holding. I pressed the brass clasps of my leather briefcase shut. The psychological discipline required to maintain my composed, supportive facade across the past week had been immense. But tomorrow night, the mask of the gracious father-in-law would finally come off. I intended to let him rise and deliver his carefully rehearsed, emotionally charged toasts. I intended to let him absorb the warm applause of an unsuspecting room. I would let him reach the very peak of his arrogant confidence, standing tall beneath the glittering lights of a crowded ballroom. The grand ballroom of the Post Oak Hotel was a breathtaking exercise in manufactured elegance and concentrated wealth. I had held nothing back for this rehearsal dinner, transforming the vast space into a pristine vision of cascading white orchids, shimmering crystal, and warm ambient light. 100 of Houston's most influential and powerful filled the carefully arranged tables, prominent politicians, sharp-edged hedge fund managers, and titans of commercial real estate, all turned out in their finest evening wear. The soft, melodic sound of a live jazz trio drifted through the room, perfectly masking the deep, suffocating tension radiating quietly from my end of the head table. I sat motionless, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching the elaborate performance unfolding directly in front of me. Colt Farrow was working the room with the polished, effortless ease of a seasoned politician. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal black tuxedo that draped his frame without a wrinkle. He moved from table to table, shaking hands, pressing cheeks, flashing that bright and practiced smile at my closest friends and most trusted associates. To anyone without the full picture, he looked precisely like a confident, wildly successful technology executive, genuinely humbled to be marrying into the prominent Mercer family. He radiated complete invincibility. He was certain the $10 million investment contract, sitting in federal compliance, was working its way through the system. He believed he had successfully steered through the turbulent waters of his financial crisis. He had absolutely no idea that the loan sharks he had been hiding from no longer owned a cent of his debt. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that the man sitting quietly at the head table was now his sole and absolute master. Beside him, my daughter Audrey was radiant with a deep, glowing happiness that ached to witness. She wore a stunning sapphire blue evening gown that perfectly reflected her vibrant, joyful spirit. She laughed at Colt's rehearsed jokes and looked up at him with an expression of pure, unguarded adoration. She had spent her entire day at the pediatric clinic, pouring herself into the care of sick children. And now she was celebrating what she believed to be the most significant milestone of her life. She was fully convinced she was seated beside her soulmate. The sheer depth of her trust made my chest tighten with a sharp, aching grief. In order to spare her a lifetime of financial ruin and emotional devastation, I was going to have to publicly destroy the man she loved. I was going to shatter that beautiful illusion into pieces right here in front of everyone she held dear. It was the heaviest burden a father could carry, but my resolve held forged in something colder and harder than steel. The dinner service moved forward with flawless orchestrated precision. A brigade of professional waiters glided silently through the ballroom, delivering courses of butter-poached halibut, perfectly seared prime ribeye, and delicate wild mushroom risotto. The champagne flowed without pause, filling the crystal flutes of my unsuspecting guests. I watched Beau, the best man, seated a few places away. He was sweating through that expensive suit, draining his wineglass faster than a man at ease ever would, eyes skittering nervously across the grand room. He knew precisely what Colt had set in motion. He had stood inside my private library and laughed about my daughter being a desperate cow. He was a spineless accomplice to the emotional destruction of my child, and he would go down with the ship that was now bearing down fast. As the last of the dessert plates were quietly whisked away by the attentive staff, the ballroom's ambient lighting eased into a softer glow, and the low hum of polite conversation faded into expectant stillness. Colt rose from his chair at the center of the long head table. He lifted his crystal champagne flute and reached for a silver spoon, tapping it against the glass in a clean, ringing note that pulled every gaze in the room to attention. 100 faces swung toward the handsome, beaming groom. Colt straightened his tuxedo jacket and surveyed the sea of wealthy, well-connected guests before him. He drew a slow, practiced breath, flawlessly imitating the slight catch of a man overcome by genuine feeling. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Colt began, his voice carrying smoothly through the high-quality surround sound. Speakers ringing the room, he let a quiet, tender smile settle on his lips. "Looking out at this incredible room, at so many cherished friends and beloved family, I am truly humbled. But there is only one face I want to find right now." He turned, angling his warm, magnetic gaze down toward Audrey. She looked up at him, eyes bright with tears she hadn't yet let fall. "Audrey, you are the single greatest thing that has ever walked into my life." Colt said, his voice dipping lower, wrapping itself in a carefully engineered tenderness. "Before you, my world was swallowed by the relentless grind of building a technology company. I was always in motion, chasing the next milestone, hunting the next impossible summit. And then you came into my life, carrying all that boundless compassion and that beautiful healing spirit. You showed me how to slow down. You taught me what it actually means to live for something beyond yourself. You saved me, Audrey. You are my anchor, my reason, my greatest achievement of all. I will spend every remaining day of my life showing you exactly how much I love you." A wave of audible emotion rolled through the crowded ballroom. Several women near the front tables were already reaching into their purses for tissues. Audrey lifted a hand and gently caught a single joyful tear on her cheek. It was a masterful, sickeningly brilliant performance. He stood there actively plotting to drain her trust fund and vanished to Miami with his pregnant mistress while convincing an entire room full of sharp, successful people that he was a devoted and flawless romantic. Colt then drew his gaze away from my daughter and pointed it directly at me. He raised his crystal flute a little higher, his confident smile widening. "And to Vincent, thank you." Colt continued, his voice wrapped in a tone of practiced, humble reverence. "Thank you for opening the doors of your remarkable family to me with such generosity. Thank you for your incredible mentorship, your tireless support, and your wisdom. You have built something magnificent, sir, and I give you my word, I will honor what you have built by taking exceptional care of your most precious treasure. To Vincent and to my beautiful bride, to Vincent and Audrey." The grand ballroom rang with the toast glasses lifting high across the room. I did not raise mine. I sat still at the head of the table, my face a blank wall. Slowly, I slid my right hand into the pocket of my tailored jacket. My fingers found the cool, hard plastic of the audio-visual remote. The season of polite illusions was finished. The storm had arrived. The applause that followed Colt's toast was deafening. He stood there basking in the admiration of Houston high society, a brilliant actor savoring his final bow before the curtain fell. I let the clapping run for a few long seconds, letting him drink in the very peak of his manufactured triumph. Then I stood up. I eased my chair back slowly, the legs whispering against the polished marble floor. I reached forward and lifted the silver microphone from the center of the table. The movement was quiet, but the room noticed. The applause tapered off, replaced by a respectful, waiting silence. Hundreds of eyes settled on me, the patriarch of the Mercer family expecting my blessing. Colt looked my way with a broad, steady smile, his champagne flute perfectly still in his hand. Beside him, my daughter Audrey leaned forward slightly, her face luminous with love and anticipation. She was completely certain I was about to welcome this man into our family. "Thank you, Colt," I began. My voice filled every corner of the ballroom through the high-fidelity speakers, deep measured and stripped entirely of the warmth I had carefully projected for the past 3 weeks. I looked out across the room. I saw corporate titans, politicians, and physicians who had watched my daughter grow from a little girl. Then, I turned my gaze back to the groom. "It is rather fitting that you mentioned building an empire tonight." I continued, moving slowly behind the head table. "Because empires are not raised on charm or hollow promises. They are built on a foundation of absolute trust, on transparency, on loyalty, on the fierce protection of those you claim to love. When you invite a man into your empire, you had better be certain of his character. You had better know exactly who he is when the lights go down and no one is watching." Colt's smile slipped just a fraction. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He cut a glance toward Beau, who was staring down at his plate, perspiration soaking through his collar. Audrey tilted her head, sensing the change in my tone, but still too innocent to read what was coming. I stopped moving and stood directly behind Colt. "So I decided to verify that character for myself," I said evenly. I made a subtle gesture with my left hand toward the production booth at the back of the room, a silent signal to the audiovisual technicians I had personally hired for this precise moment. In an instant, the ballroom's elegant lighting cut to black. A low mechanical hum moved through the stillness. Behind the head table directly above where Colt and Audrey sat, a massive 30-foot projection screen began its slow descent from the ceiling, the heavy canvas unrolling with a dull, ominous thud. Guests stirred and murmured, shifting in their seats, most assuming this was some kind of sentimental video tribute to the happy couple. Colt turned to look at the blank screen, his brow creased in genuine confusion. He turned back toward me, mouth beginning to open. I did not give him the chance. I pressed the small button on the remote concealed in my pocket. The high-definition speakers crackled to life. No music, no video. Only the crisp, crystal-clear audio pulled from the shadows of my private library just a few weeks before. I would rather chew glass than touch that desperate cow. Colt's voice detonated through the ballroom, loud, unmistakable, soaked in contempt. The sound bounced off the crystal chandeliers and the marble walls. The entire ballroom stopped breathing as one. 100 of the most powerful people in Houston went rigid with pure, unfiltered shock. The atmosphere collapsed from joyous celebration into something cold and paralyzing. "Come on, man. She is not that bad." Bo's recorded voice offered a nervous, half-hearted chuckle through the speakers. "Are you kidding me?" Colt's recorded voice came back sharp and sneering, every syllable of his cold arrogance preserved perfectly. "She is clingy. She is obsessed. And frankly, she is a desperate cow. But she is the only child of Vincent Mercer. Do you have any idea what that means? Once we sign that registry, I get the keys to the Mercer Trust Fund. I just have to play the devoted husband for 2 years. Then I cash out, file for divorce, and I am back on a yacht in Miami with Sable." The recording cut off, leaving behind a silence so absolute, so crushingly heavy, it felt as though the air itself had been vacuumed from the room. 3 agonizing seconds passed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sheer brutality of what had just been laid bare held everyone frozen in place. Then, reality landed. A sharp, violent crack split the quiet. Audrey had let go of her crystal champagne flute. It struck the marble floor and exploded into 1,000 glittering fragments around her designer heels. I looked down at my daughter. Every drop of color had fled her face, leaving her ghostly white. Her eyes were fixed wide on the darkened screen, her mind fighting desperately to reject what her ears had just been forced to hear. Her mouth fell open and a small choked sound escaped her, as though she'd taken a blow directly to the chest. "Dad," she whispered, and the trembling, broken agony in that single word physically cracked something inside me. Every instinct told me to pull her close and shield her from this. But the operation was not finished. There was still demolition left to do. Colt lurched up from his chair, as though a branding iron had been pressed against his back. The polished, unshakable facade he had worn for an entire year came apart in a single instant. His face twisted into something raw and panicked, his chest heaving as he swept his gaze across the sea of horrified guests. Prominent socialites had their hands pressed over their mouths. Corporate executives fixed him with open, withering contempt. Bo, the best man, had practically melted out of his chair, doing everything in his power to disappear from the wreckage of his own complicity. "Turn that off!" Colt shouted, his voice fracturing as he jabbed a shaking finger at the projection screen. "That is not real. It is a complete lie. That is artificially generated audio, a malicious deep fake put together to destroy my reputation." "Vincent, what is the meaning of this?" I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I stood perfectly still and looked at the cornered predator thrashing inside the trap I had built for him, watching him hurl desperate lies into the suffocating silence of the room. He was clutching at any shred of plausible deniability he could find, with no idea that I was holding a full arsenal of heavy artillery, ready to reduce him to rubble. I remained behind Colt, the silver microphone steady in my grip. The panic radiating off him was almost a physical thing, a frantic, crackling energy that filled the dark ballroom. He genuinely believed that if he waved his hands and shouted the words "deep fake" loud enough, the cold, recorded truth would somehow dissolve back into the air. He thought he was dealing with a technologically naive old man who could be rattled by a modern buzzword. He was about to discover just how catastrophically he had misjudged me. I did not raise my voice. I did not take the bait. I simply regarded him with an expression of cool, detached amusement, reached into my jacket pocket, and pressed the remote a second time. The darkened screen behind the head table blazed to life. A sharp, high-definition image lit up the massive canvas, throwing a stark white light across 100 horrified faces. It was not a family slideshow. It was a digital dossier of complete financial destruction. The first slide showed high-resolution scans of official bank ledgers, certified by forensic accountants, with Colt's $4 million debt highlighted in bold red at the top. The breakdown left no room for interpretation. $2 million is owed to a private equity firm in New York, currently pursuing him for corporate fraud, and $2 million is owed to an illicit lending syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. An audible gasp moved through the room in a wave. Several prominent business associates near the front leaned forward, eyes sharpening as they recognized the official institutional seals on the documents. "You told us the audio was a deep fake, Colt," I said, my voice carrying easily through every corner of the room. "Tell me, is this spreadsheet a deep fake as well? Are these certified records of your $4 million insolvency also the product of artificial intelligence?" Colt's mouth came open. Nothing came out. The color left him in a rush, and under the bright stage lighting, he looked like something already dead. He turned and stared at the screen, as if he were peering into the mouth of hell. I clicked the remote again. The slide shifted. The next image showed a series of wire transfer receipts from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Over the span of 12 months, $30,000 had been moved every single month like clockwork into a private account in Florida. Alongside the financial records sat a high-resolution photograph taken on a sun-drenched deck in Miami. Colt, in dark sunglasses, laughing without a care in the world. On a luxury yacht, his arm wrapped around the waist of a 24-year-old blonde model named Sable. The fit of her dress left nothing to interpretation. She was visibly, undeniably 4 months pregnant. The ballroom came apart at the seams. Women gasped, hands flying to their mouths. Men leaned into their wives, whispering furiously, eyes locked on the massive screen. The immaculate veneer of Houston high society cracked and gave way in a matter of seconds. These were guests who had been elegantly sipping champagne moments ago. Now they were watching the methodical public dismantling of a con artist. I pulled my gaze from the crowd and turned it to my daughter. What I saw broke me. The radiant bride of 5 minutes ago was gone entirely. Audrey sat rigid in her chair, hands trembling in her lap, eyes pinned to the photograph of Colt and his pregnant mistress on that yacht. She studied the dates on the wire transfers and absorbed the full, devastating truth. While Colt was whispering vows of eternal devotion to her in Houston, he had been quietly funding a second life in Florida with money he planned to take from her. The shock in her eyes burned slowly away, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The veil of trusting, unconditional love that had covered her eyes for a year was torn away in one violent motion, leaving the ugly, predatory reality fully exposed beneath it. "Colt," Audrey's voice broke through the noise of the room. It was not anger. It was the sound of something being crushed from the inside. Is that real? Audrey, please." Colt swung toward her, both hands extended in naked desperation, sweat streaming down his forehead and soaking into his tuxedo collar. "She is nobody. I swear to you it is not what it looks like. I was being set up. I love you." "You love my trust fund," Audrey answered, and her voice had dropped into a register I had never once heard from her, quiet, precise, and lethally cold. She rose slowly from the head table, her sapphire blue gown catching the light. She looked at the man she had intended to spend her life with, and what had been a heartbroken bride's expression hardened into a wall of absolute disgust. "You never loved me. You looked at me and saw a payday." I stepped between them, putting myself squarely in front of my daughter. I looked directly at Colt, my thumb resting on the remote, ready for the final slide. "We are not quite finished, Colt," I said, and my voice carried the full weight of absolute authority. "Because being a bankrupt fraud and a serial liar was apparently not enough for you. You decided to go one step further 2 days ago." I pressed the remote a final time. The screen filled with a high-resolution scan of a federal banking document, the Joint Asset Authorization Form, submitted to the Mercer Wealth Management Branch. At the bottom of the page, alongside Colt's signature, was Audrey's name. The handwriting was jagged, forced, and bore no resemblance to hers whatsoever. Directly beside the document was a crystal-clear security camera frame showing Colt standing at a bank teller window, physically handing over the falsified paperwork to extract a $2 million advance. "This is your fiancée, Audrey," I announced, making certain every syllable reached every corner of that ballroom. A man so strangled by debts to loan sharks that he walked into a federal financial institution 48 hours ago and forged your signature to steal $2 million directly from your trust. The revelation detonated through the room. Bo, the best man, shoved his chair back and made straight for the side exit, abandoning his friend to face the wreckage entirely alone. The remaining guests stared at Colt with open revulsion. He was no longer merely a scheming gold digger. He was a dangerous, desperate criminal, exposed in front of the most powerful legal and political minds in the state of Texas. Colt scanned the room and understood all at once every exit was sealed, every lie was spent, and the brilliant manipulative architecture of his scheme had collapsed completely into ash. The rat had finally run out of corners. For 5 agonizing seconds, Colt Farrow stood frozen beneath the merciless glare of that massive screen, his chest working in short, shallow heaves. He looked at the Houston executives, the prominent politicians, the wealthy socialites who had been admiring him just minutes before. Every face that looked back at him wore the same expression, naked, unvarnished revulsion. He turned to Audrey. She sat still in her chair, watching him with a cold, devastating clarity that stripped every last ounce of the power he had once held over her. His entire carefully built world had been taken apart piece by piece, systematically and completely. I watched the transformation happen right in front of me. The charming, polished technology executive dissolved before my eyes, leaving behind only what had always been there, a cornered, desperate predator with nowhere left to run. When a narcissist discovers that his elaborate deception has unraveled, he does not feel remorse. He does not seek forgiveness or offer an apology. He goes to war. Colt let out a sound that was half sob, half furious snarl. He lunged forward, both hands crashing down onto the white tablecloth. Silverware clattered violently against the fine china, shattering the heavy quiet of the grand ballroom. He reached across the floral centerpieces, fingers closing aggressively around a spare silver microphone sitting near the podium. He seized it, his knuckles draining to white. A screech of audio feedback tore through the air, and several guests in the front row winced, clapping their hands over their ears. Colt gripped the microphone with both hands, chest heaving as he fixed his glare directly on me. That handsome face had twisted into something ugly, a mask of pure, undisguised malice. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Vincent?" He spat, his voice cracking through the high-definition speakers. "You think you can stand up here and humiliate me in front of all these people? You think you have won because you put a few bank statements on a projection screen? You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with." I did not move a single muscle. I held my posture perfectly rigid, my face an impenetrable wall of calm. I let him keep digging. He dragged his venomous gaze from me and leveled it at my daughter. Audrey flinched instinctively, drawing her arms around herself, as though bracing against a physical blow. "You want to talk about transparency?" Colt shouted, pacing back and forth, behind the head table like something caged and cornered. "You want to talk about exposing the real truth to the good people of Houston? Let us talk about the flawless Dr. Audrey Mercer. Let us talk about the perfect pediatrician who spends her days saving children." A fresh wave of chilling tension rolled over the crowded ballroom. The guests, who had been murmuring in shocked disbelief just a moment before, went completely silent, held hostage by the sudden vicious escalation of a man pushed past his breaking point. Colt jabbed a shaking finger directly at my daughter. "I have lived with you for a year, Audrey," he snarled, every word soaked in venom. "I have had full access to your personal phone, your private computer, and your secure cloud storage. Did you really think a man like me walks into an empire like this without securing a substantial insurance policy?" He swung back toward me, a manic grin stretching across his sweat-soaked face. "I have photographs, Vincent. I have highly sensitive, deeply compromising digital files. Things from her college years, private videos, intimate conversations she shared with me in complete confidence. Things that would obliterate her medical career. If I release those files to the local press, the hospital board will strip her medical license before sunrise. She will never practice medicine again. She will be a public disgrace, a walking scandal that poisons the Mercer legacy forever." Gasps of genuine horror broke from the audience. Several prominent physicians seated near the center aisle rose to their feet, faces flushed with anger, ready to step forward, but I lifted my left hand, signaling them to stay seated. I could not allow anyone else to step into this line of fire. This was my battle to finish. I looked at Audrey. She was staring at Colt in sheer unfiltered disbelief. She knew there were no compromising photographs. She knew she had never sent him anything scandalous. She had lived a quiet, focused life built entirely around her medical career. But in an era of digital manipulation and relentless media scrutiny, the mere whisper of a scandal can be enough to permanently destroy a reputation. Colt was bluffing, but it was a terrifying bluff from a man with nothing left to lose. He understood that even the suggestion of impropriety could cast a long, dark shadow over her professional life. He was wagering on my instinct as a father to protect her from any possible harm, however fabricated the threat. He clutched the microphone in both hands, chest heaving, and delivered his final ultimatum. "You are going to take out your phone right now, Vincent." Colt's voice cracked under the crushing pressure of the moment. "You are going to authorize an immediate transfer of $10 million into the offshore account you just put on that screen. You are going to wire that money right now in front of every person in this room. If that capital does not clear my account within the next 5 minutes, I hit send. I have an automated email queued up for every major news outlet and gossip blog in the state of Texas. You wire the money, and I walk out those doors, and you never hear from me again. You refuse, and I burn your precious daughter to the ground." The room froze. The air turned thick with a suffocating dread. Colt reached into his tuxedo pocket and produced his mobile phone, raising it high for the entire room to see. His thumb hovered dramatically over the screen, poised to execute his digital extortion. His eyes darted frantically between me, my daughter, and the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. He was convinced he had just seized the upper hand, that he had successfully leveraged his way back from total annihilation. I stood perfectly still, letting the full, terrible weight of his threat settle over the room. I looked at this panicked, desperate man holding my daughter's reputation as hostage. I could see the terror vibrating through every rigid line of his posture. He was a cornered rat lashing out with the only weapon he had left. The executives in the audience watched me with bated breath, waiting to see if the real estate mogul would bend the knee to protect his family from disgrace. They expected me to reach for my phone. They expected negotiation. They expected a plea or a surrender to the blackmail. I did none of those things. I simply looked at him, my expression stripped entirely of fear, anger, and any trace of willingness to yield. The psychological war had reached its absolute peak, and Colt had just played his very last card. I stood motionless on the elevated platform. Colt held his phone like a weapon, fully expecting me to crumble. He expected me to beg. I looked at his sweat-soaked face and smiled. It was the cold, measured expression of an apex predator, watching its prey step into a carefully laid snare. "You are attempting to extort me for $10 million, I said, my voice carrying effortlessly through the silent ballroom. "You are threatening to destroy the medical career of the woman you claim to love, unless I wire wealth into your offshore account. You believe you have forced my hand, Colt, but you have fundamentally misread the situation. You assumed I intended to invest in your fraudulent technology company." Colt lowered his phone. The manic confidence in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by deep, dawning confusion. He looked at me, chest still heaving. "What are you saying?" he stammered. "I signed the investment contract. You told me the money was clearing federal compliance." "I never authorized a wire transfer to your business account," I explained. "I used my commercial real estate capital for an entirely different purpose. I used my money to purchase your debt. I bought the $2 million obligation from the private equity firm in New York. I used a corporate proxy to acquire the remaining $2 million from the lending syndicate in Las Vegas. I paid them in pure liquid cash. They released your promissory notes directly to my holding company. I am not your investor, Colt. I am your creditor. You owe me $4 million. Every last trace of color left his face. His jaw went slack. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers and struck the polished marble floor with a sharp clatter. He stared at me, and I could see the full weight of it landing. The violent loan sharks he had been hiding from were no longer chasing him. They had sold his debt to me. The private equity firm had sold his obligations to me. He was imprisoned inside a cage of his own construction. But I signed an agreement. He whispered, his voice barely audible over the stunned murmurs of the audience surrounding him. You promised me $10 million. You promised it would clear by Wednesday. Yes, I replied smoothly, projecting complete and total command over the moment. You signed a 60-page legal document without troubling yourself to read the fine print. You were so thoroughly blinded by your own greed that you failed to notice the blanket line my attorneys meticulously placed on every asset in your name. You willingly pledged your luxury condominium, your vehicles, your hidden offshore accounts, and your fraudulent shell company as direct collateral for a loan you were never going to receive. You formally agreed to a moral turpitude clause. The agreement explicitly states that any act of fraud or extortion triggers the entire debt as immediately payable on demand. You just attempted to extort me for $10 million in front of 100 prominent witnesses. You pulled the trigger on that default clause yourself. Colt staggered backward as though he had been struck. His shoulders caved as the full inescapable weight of his situation crushed down on him. He had no money left to steal. He had no leverage left to exploit. He was $4 million in debt to the very man whose family he had tried to destroy. I now legally own your luxury condominium, I said, my voice carrying no warmth whatsoever. I own your bank accounts outright. I own every asset you will ever acquire for the remainder of your miserable life. You will spend decades attempting to repay me, and you will never get there. But financial ruin is only the opening act of your punishment. I pulled my gaze from him and looked toward the back of the grand ballroom. I gave a quiet nod to the security team. The heavy oak doors swung open with a resounding thud. My corporate attorney, Conrad Whitfield, strode confidently into the room, flanked by 4 federal agents in dark suits, wearing expressions that left no room for negotiation. They moved with swift, clean authority down the center aisle, parting the sea of stunned guests as they came. Colt turned his head and saw them closing on the head table. Pure terror seized his face. His eyes swept the room in a frantic search for any exit that might still be open. There was none. The ballroom was completely sealed. He was surrounded by every person he had tried to deceive, and every law enforcement official he could never charm his way past. His breathing fractured as the permanence of his failure settled over him. "Vincent, please," Colt begged, his voice shattering as the lead agent stepped onto the elevated platform. "I was just venting. I was angry. I did not mean any of it. Audrey, tell them I was upset." He reached toward my daughter, pleading with her to pull him back from the edge. Audrey did not move. She rose to her full height, her sapphire blue gown catching the light. She looked directly at the broken man before her, and her eyes held not a single trace of affection. The illusion had been completely erased. The lead federal agent stepped in front of Colt. He reached to his belt and produced a set of heavy steel handcuffs. "Colt Farrow," the agent said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and the forgery of a federal banking document. You are also charged with attempted extortion." The agent seized Colt by the shoulder and spun him around forcefully, pressing him chest first against the white tablecloth. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Colt began to sob openly, a raw, pathetic sound. He wept for his lost freedom. "No!" he cried out as the agents pulled him to his feet. "Please do not do this. I am sorry." I watched with quiet satisfaction as they walked him across the marble floor. He resisted weakly against their grip. The assembled guests stared at him with unmasked revulsion as he was marched down the center aisle, stripped of his dignity and his freedom in front of every person he had tried to impress. As Colt was steered toward the exit, he glanced back at Audrey one last time, his mouth opening to beg. She did not let him. She slid the expensive engagement ring from her finger, held it over his half-empty champagne flute, and released it. The diamond struck the glass with a sharp, clean clink. "You can use that to pay your defense attorney," she said quietly. Her voice was steady and resolute. "Goodbye, Colt." The agents pulled him through the heavy doors, and the click of the latch behind them rang out with a note of absolute finality. The predator was gone. The grand ballroom held its silence. I turned and looked at my daughter. The composure she had shown in those moments filled my chest with a swell of pure pride. She had faced betrayal head-on and come through it with her dignity entirely intact. I walked to her and opened my arms. The strong front she had maintained cracked at last. She stepped into my embrace and sobbed, her face pressed against my shoulder, crying for the man she thought she had known. I wrapped my arms around her, shielding her from the audience. "I've got you, sweetheart," I whispered. "You are safe now. I will always protect you." The psychological war was officially over. The trap had worked without a flaw. I had dismantled the man who came from my family and ensured that he would never touch my daughter again. The days following the catastrophic rehearsal dinner moved with swift and merciless momentum. Colt Farrow was immediately remanded into federal custody, denied bail given the severity of his flight risk, and the sheer irrefutable weight of the evidence we placed directly in the prosecution's hands. His trial was a brief and humiliating affair. Stripped of his tailored suits and his manufactured charm, he sat at the defense table looking like the hollow, empty shell he had always been. The federal judge extended no leniency whatsoever. Colt was sentenced to 8 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive bank fraud, identity forgery, and attempted extortion. He was permanently removed from civilized society, but his incarceration was only the first phase of my promise. I had acquired his entire $4 million debt, and I intended to collect every single cent. Through Conrad Whitfield, I executed the blanket lien with ruthless surgical precision. I legally seized his luxury condominium in the heart of downtown Houston. I seized his expensive imported vehicles, his designer watch collection, and his hidden offshore bank accounts. I liquidated his entire pathetic existence without mercy, selling off the physical monuments to his superficial greed to the highest bidders. When the final asset was sold and the last account drained, I took the full sum of recovered funds and donated them to a prominent domestic abuse shelter in Miami. I made the donation entirely in Audrey's name. It was a fitting conclusion, a kind of poetic justice. The money he had schemed and manipulated to bankroll his secret life was ultimately redirected to protect and empower vulnerable women. For Audrey, the immediate aftermath of the betrayal was a season of deep, quiet mourning. She did not mourn the man who was taken to federal prison. She mourned the beautiful, innocent illusion she had given her heart to. She stepped away from her grueling schedule at the hospital for a month, retreating to the peace of our family estate to work through the ordeal. We spent countless hours walking through the sprawling gardens together, talking openly about her late mother, about trust, and about the harder realities of the world beyond our walls. I watched my daughter move through the darkest chapter of her life with a quiet, fierce grace that filled me with overwhelming pride. She came to understand that she did not need a charismatic, manipulative partner to confirm her worth. She was already whole. When she finally stepped out of that healing period, she was fundamentally different. The gentle, compassionate pediatrician was still there, but she was now fortified by a deep, unshakable wisdom. She decided she no longer wanted to practice beneath the bureaucratic weight of a large institution. She wanted to build something of her own, a place where she could practice medicine entirely on her own terms. 6 months after Colt was led away in handcuffs, Audrey officially opened Audrey's independent pediatric clinic. She funded the entire operation herself, using the very trust fund that Colt had so desperately tried to get his hands on. I attended the grand opening, standing quietly near the back of the bright, welcoming reception area. I watched her direct her new medical staff with confidence and greet the families who had followed her to the new practice. Her eyes were vivid and entirely free of the heavy shadows that had haunted her for months. She was thriving, building her own magnificent legacy from nothing but her own strength and will. Later that evening, after the clinic had closed and the staff had gone home, Audrey and I sat together in her new private office. We drank cheap coffee from paper cups and talked about the future. The bond between us had been tested in fire and forged into something completely unbreakable. She looked at me across her new desk, her face reflecting a trust that ran bone deep. She thanked me for protecting her, for seeing the truth clearly when love had blinded her to it, and for having the courage to do what was necessary, regardless of how difficult it was. I smiled and took her hand, and I told her that protecting her had been the single greatest privilege of my entire life. I am 70 years old. I have negotiated thousands of complex, high-stakes deals with ruthless people across a long and demanding career. I have built a substantial commercial real estate empire across the state of Texas that will outlast my lifetime and provide for generations to come. But standing quietly in that grand ballroom, watching the dangerous, arrogant predator who had called my daughter a desperate cow get dragged away in cold steel handcuffs, I knew I had achieved my ultimate victory. It was without a single lingering doubt the greatest and most rewarding return on investment I have ever made in my life. True wealth is not measured by the balance of your accounts, but by the lengths you are willing to go for the people you love. Predators will always exist dressed in tailored suits, armed with charming smiles, hunting for kindness to exploit. Never allow your desire for a peaceful family life to blind you to the warning signs standing right in front of you. Trust your instincts. When someone reveals their true character in the shadows, believe what you see immediately. Money can buy houses, companies, and influence, but its most powerful use is exposing the truth and dismantling those who build their lives on deception. Every road I walk and every time I choose to rise when falling would be easier. I carry your courage deep inside my heart. Your fire burns within my soul. And though the years keep rolling on, your love still finds me, still guides me home. You showed me that real strength is not found in power, but in choosing kindness when kindness costs something. You showed me how to keep moving forward when the road turns cold and the light grows thin. Every lesson, every story, every laugh shared beside the fire lives inside me like an echo calling softly back through the years. And when I stand before my greatest battles, when I feel I have nothing left to give, I still hear your voice close beside me, saying, "Child, you are stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter." Every step I take, every time I choose to stand, when breaking would come easier, I carry your courage in my heart. Your fire lives inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover all the footprints. One day the fire will burn to embers. But what a father gives his daughter is the kind of thing that never fades. Not the gold, not the victories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet, steady way he loved her and the woman that she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy, and every pain. The world may shift around me, the stars above may dim, but I will carry with me always my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I will smile and answer softly. I am my Father's daughter. I am my Father's daughter. And that is where the story of Vincent Mercer comes to rest. Not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, but in a small office with 2 paper cups of coffee and a daughter who finally knew she was safe. Protecting Audrey cost me weeks of silence, of pretending to welcome a man I despised into my home. It cost me the performance of a lifetime, watching him smile and toast and believe he had already won. But I believe God places certain moments in front of us not to break us, but to show us what we are truly capable of when the people we love are at stake. What I gained in return was something no amount of money could ever purchase: my daughter, clear-eyed and whole, building a life on ground that no one could take from her. If these father stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. First charm is not character. A man who performs devotion in public but speaks contempt in private has already shown you everything you need to know. Believe the private version. Second, when someone underestimates you, let them. Colt's arrogance was the very thing that handed me every advantage I needed. Stay quiet and prepare. Third, patience is not weakness. What looks like a father standing by is sometimes a father building the walls of a trap. Real protection sometimes takes time. And finally, the most powerful thing a dad's revenge can accomplish is not punishment. It is restoration. It is handing your child back their future with both hands. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me what you took from it. Share it with someone who has a daughter they would go to the ends of the earth for, or someone who needs a reminder that justice does not always arrive loudly. And if you want more stories like this, subscribing to His Hidden Revenge is the simplest way to make sure you never miss one. Thank you for spending this time with me. It means everything. Until next time, take good care of the people who matter.